I'm going to introduce Mr. Christie by introducing to you a pamphlet put out by Seafire, in which they give him a wonderful introduction. That way, if there's any mistakes, it won't be mine. Born in Winnipeg in 1946, Douglas Christie earned his law degree from the University of British Columbia in 1970 and has practiced law in Victoria ever since. Christie, unlike many of the legal profession, is consumed by a passion for justice and freedom, rather than money. So we're not going to pay him. He has often taken unremunerative or unpopular cases. Sometimes called the Clarence Darrow of Canada, Christie has recently achieved considerable recognition as a defense lawyer for Ernest Sundell and James Keegstra. The Keegstra case, the topic of this booklet, suits my personality, says Christie, because freedom of speech is something I fervently believe in. My father always taught me to be true to myself. It's when people's ideas are not popular that the real test of freedom comes. And this was published in the Globe and Mail March 1st, 1985. Christie, who has been dubbed the battling barrister, operates from a tiny converting parking lot attendant's office in a downtown Victoria parking lot. The two-room, single-story office is dwarfed by a building of ultra-modern legal offices just beside the parking lot. Christie, a devout Catholic, eschews the flash and glitter of so many upwardly mobile lawyers and prefers the rural peace of his 12-acre farm near Souk, on which he raises goats and ducks. Christie is a founder and leader of the Western Canada Concept Party. He is a fervent opponent of compulsory metric and forced bilingualism and what he terms big brotherism. He told a freedom of speech seminar in Calgary, May 25th, 1984, "The tyranny I fight today is the tyranny of relativism and secular humanism. It has unleashed the McCarthyism of the left. It is to combat this witch hunt against unfashionable views that Christie has taken clients such as James Keegstra and Ernst Sundell. His principles have not been without risk. On June 7th, 1984, his Victoria office was vandalized and a swastika painted on his door. Several times during the Sundell trial, his office windows were broken. He has received death threats. On the opening day of the Sundell trial, he and his legal assistant, Kelty Zupko, had to force their way through a cursing, spitting, punishing Jewish Defense League protest outside the court. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my proud and pleasurable duty to welcome Mr. Douglas Christie.
Thank you very much. Doesn't he have a magnificent voice? I think he should be on the CBC making announcements of some sort.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's a compliment or not, really, considering what we know of the CBC. I was very pleasantly surprised, and you reminded me of the fact that I was born in 1946. It's all hearsay. I'm not sure of that. I wasn't conscious at the time, but it's true that everyone agrees I was born in Winnipeg in 1946, and when I first had a chance to talk to Malcolm Ross at a length of time, we were chatting about where we were born, and we were walking in Fredericton by the river there, and I was surprised to find he was born in Winnipeg, and he said, "Oh yes, Winnipeg and Grace Hospital, and May the 1st, 1946, I think that's right, isn't it?" Yeah, so I was surprised, and I thought, gee, that's the same hospital I was born in on the 24th of April, 1946. So I thought I'd check with my mother, and I did, and I found out, you too? Not Winnipeg, I hope. No, well, you're lucky. Not everybody is that unfortunate. But it's good you were born. I mean, but I found out that in those days, women stayed in the hospital more than about 10 days. So there was Malcolm Ross and myself in the same nursery in the same hospital in 1946. Yeah. So I have some good news and some bad news. I guess I should start with the bad news first. There's another complaint against a Ross by the Human Rights Commission. I guess you should know about this. Yes, I understand it's a very serious case. Bill's dog is rumored to have attacked a dog of another species in 1977. And so Bill's dog, he is a German Shepherd, you see, and I gather in 1977 he attacked a dog of another species. And it should be coming up before the Human Rights Commission in a couple of years at the rate they move. The good news is the dog hasn't made a statement. And I was going to say how delighted I was to see so many young people here, and notice also so many people having families, so many young people, and obviously going to be some more young people, and I thought that's tremendous because I come from Victoria, which is comprised of the newlywed and nearly dead. The newlywed are usually those who wish they weren't, it seems, because they certainly don't have very large or if any families, and the nearly dead, I guess, sometimes wish they were. That's an impression you get, at least living there for a while. I was interested to hear that because of the current trend towards, kind of revisionism in the leftist sense of the word, there's going to be a new series of Davy Crockett out. And I was just hearing tonight that in this new series, Davy Crockett is going to be a homosexual who doesn't fight Indians. He reports them to the Indian Human Rights Commission and grieves the case that way. So we can see there is progress being made in the process of what might be called kind of modernizing history. So I guess it seems to be all right for some people and not all right for others. That's really the problem, because you see, in a serious vein, I think the most profound truth about human nature, about all of us, is that we need to know the truth. And I think the most articulate way that was ever expressed was in the words, "Know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Of course, we all recognize that from a rather well-known book in which it's interpreted to mean that, to know Jesus Christ will be the freedom of salvation, which I certainly agree. But it has a broader meaning than that, as most truth does. It applies universally. And to know the truth and to be set free by the truth is really the object of every thinking person. If we lived in a world of ignorance, if we never learned anything that was true, we would be no different than the animals. And if we never sought the truth, we would be entirely without any purpose to our brains. And that would be a great tragedy, because most of us, and I think most of us in life generally, are endowed with an intelligence that deserves to be satisfied. We all want to learn, and we all want to know. And thank God we do, because it's true that knowledge is power. And I think that's really the reason why some people don't want any knowledge to be communicated without their permission, because it would interfere with their power. So everyone really needs to know the truth, but as Pontius Pilate said, I think, what is truth? And that's the question that I guess about everybody asks in life. You think you have the truth, and I know I have the truth, of course. And nobody wants to really discuss it, because I guess sometimes when we have to discuss truth, we realize we don't have it all. And maybe somebody else has some, and consequently, we have to humiliate ourselves slightly to admit that it's only in the exchange of ideas that truth is ever really found. And that's where I think we come to the very essence of my brief discussion tonight, which is the reason why we need freedom of speech, freedom of communication, freedom of thought, belief, and opinion, as our erstwhile Constitution alleges that we have. So how shall we know the truth, and what is the truth, are questions that every single person has to answer for themselves, because if Big Brother answers those questions, we aren't going to be using our mind, and we probably won't get the truth. We'll get someone else's version of it, and it may not be the truth. And the great danger is, in our society, that truth is controlled to such a large extent by the two most powerful institutions in society. They are, on the one hand, government, and on the other hand, the media. And in fact, they're very closely related when you come to the broadcast media, through the control government has over broadcast licensing, and the control they have through what's called the Canadian Radio and Television Communication Commission, which is a real mouthful, summarized into CRTC. We have seen in a very brief period of time, at least it's brief to me, maybe I am more ignorant of this than others, but I have seen in the last 5 or so years an amazing increase in the power of the state and the destruction of the freedom of the individual, which I, growing up perhaps naively, thought would never occur in this land of basic freedom that I understood we all had and we all idealized. And my father was a veteran, thought he fought for freedom, and finds out 40 years after the war that there really isn't any. That the government tells you how free you can be and what you can think. The real problem is that people are not aware. Information, that is knowledge about what is actually happening, is not being communicated, you see. Very few people know anything about the real Malcolm Ross, the real Ernst Zundel, the real Jim Keegstra. They know the media, Jim Keegstra, Malcolm Ross, and Ernst Zundel, and they're totally different, of course. Many of you in this room know the real Malcolm Ross. They know the man. They know the family. They understand that the media image is totally and utterly perverted. But 99.9% of the rest of the population simply doesn't know. And as a result, knowledge being power, the power to do something about that distorted knowledge is not in the hands of the individual who is being attacked. And that is the real tragedy of mind control and thought control and the manipulation that comes about in the media. And it has brought us some very serious problems, one of which is the predicament, the tragedy, the suffering, and the unjustified persecution of an individual who happens to hold his own religious views and communicates them on his own time, that being none other than Malcolm Ross. Consider for a moment, if you will, if Malcolm Ross was a Jehovah's Witness, a group of people for whom, at least as far as their convictions are concerned, I have great respect. They certainly stand up for what they believe. He then would be obliged, as they are, to communicate his privately held religious beliefs on the street corner holding an Awake magazine. Now, in the Awake magazine, for those of you who have never read it, there are statements against the Catholic Church which could certainly be considered hate-promoting. But they are the privately held religious beliefs of those people, and I have no doubt they sincerely believe them. And no one, and certainly not I, would suggest that because they might say about the Catholic Church, of which I'm a member, that, it is, they call it all sorts of things. I think they even refer to the Whore of Babylon in some of their publications. That is not going to be interfered with. There is really no danger. Why? Because there are quite a few, and those people had to fight very hard for the right to proselytize. As you know, in Quebec there were many cases, because there Mr. Duplessis certainly thought they were a bad bunch, and he took steps to see they went to jail if he could, and those were gradually overcome. Those laws which were put in place to persecute these people because of their religious beliefs gradually were destroyed. But not so for Malcolm Ross, because he is prevented from communicating in any real sense what is actually his opinion. I mean, how many people have ever read his books or ever will be allowed to? Consequently, the image that is presented of him in the media is primarily that which his opponents would like the world to believe. Now, of course, that amounts to and results in a total distortion of an individual. And keep in mind, this individual has never been allowed the opportunity of a fair hearing in any court of law. He is not even going to get that opportunity because the situation that has developed, as you well know, is one in which he will be, if anything occurs, be taken before a human rights tribunal, which is a one-man inquiry appointed by the very government who have, through their highest officer, pronounced that he ought not to be teaching. Now, if I'm going to be judged by you, sir, and it is already announced that you think I should be in jail, I think most people would realize I might not have an unbiased judge, with all due respect to you. If the premier of this province makes statements like he did, for whatever reasons he did, and then his Minister of Labor writes a letter to one Dr. Bruce, and says, I hereby appoint you to be a judge, and that same Dr. Bruce receives appointments from that same man time after time, and he's not sworn by any oath of impartiality, I think you can understand the predicament a person coming before him in those circumstances to allegedly be tried by an impartial person. Now that, of course, is something he would have to decide. He would have to decide if he's impartial or not. These problems are not going to be explained to the vast majority of people in New Brunswick, because if it was explained in this light, they would realize how totally unjust, how totally unreasonable is this persecution. It is totally unnecessary, of course, because no effect has ever occurred or ever been demonstrated to occur from either the privately communicated beliefs of this individual or anything that he said in any class where he taught. So we have a perfect parallel to the privately expressed religious beliefs of a Jehovah's Witness, and we have the perfectly obvious fact that no evil consequences occurred in society anywhere, except perhaps in the minds of those who wish to complain. Now, of course, in society it's always true that words can cause pain. Words can cause pain because we might not like what we hear. And often it's true that we don't like what we hear, especially if it's the truth. It's often been said that it's only the truth that hurts. And I think there's a certain element of truth to that. It's consistent with human experience. So any errors or disproportionate beliefs or inaccurate beliefs a person might communicate should be viewed as part of the price we all pay every day for allowing our own freedom and expecting freedom for ourselves. We also have to put up with the fact that some people say things wrong about us. I found that out the hard way myself, because at a time when I thought I had a fairly decent reputation, a radio talk show host in Vancouver said that I was, I guess, the equivalent of a perverted monster. Those are his words, and I thought that was actionable, and the jury found it was fair comment. Well, now you know how a person has to live with some of these things, but I think probably there's a far greater need to protect the individual from the power of the media and the enormous control they have over the public mind. With a single paragraph, they can do more damage than a whole host of equal opponents in a debate, because you don't get a chance to answer. The media, however, demand and obtain their freedom, and no one challenges it. But they do not respect the freedom of individuals who differ from their point of view. And that is ultimately where you and I come in, and that's where Malcolm Ross, I think, owes you, and I think in a sense you owe him, a great debt of thanks, because together you stand for basic principles of freedom of speech. I want to mention briefly the case of another individual who is in a predicament in this country. He's about 75 or so years of age. His name is John Ross Taylor. He committed the ultimate crime, I suppose, of reading sections of the newspaper and making statements into a telephone answering machine. You know how they work? Some people have them. How many have them? Do you have any telephone answering machines? A few people do. Well, you have to phone the number to get the message. And when you do, then this tape-recorded message comes across the telephone. Then they took him up before the federal court and ordered that he serve a year in jail. He served the year in jail, got out, and recorded some new messages. He had time to think. These were somewhat different, and the old order had said you shouldn't, communicate the messages which had been the subject of the original complaint. Well, these were different messages. But now they interpret it to mean similar messages. So now he's incapable of communicating, in effect, similar messages. He's sentenced to jail for another year. This time he's quite a bit more frail and he's quite old. And let's be frank, I think, and not uncharitable to say that perhaps his messages are a little difficult to comprehend. That's all right. Maybe even better that way. I don't know. From some people's point of view, they're never satisfied. If he was incoherent, they still wouldn't be satisfied. Nonetheless, I decided at that point, and the Canadian Free Speech League decided, that this was really a total injustice, because after all, if you can't communicate your privately held opinions, And if they cannot be defended and be communicated, even if true, even if the statements are true, well then what is the point of freedom of speech at all? Really, what is the point of having any opinions if you cannot communicate them, if they might cause discrimination, whatever that means, and that's a difficult word to define, even though they might be true. We appealed to the Federal Court of Appeal, and the judges there at one point said to me, well, Mr. Christie, in this message, which says it's quoting from Revelations 2:9 and 3:9, we don't find any Revelations 29 and 39 in our Bible. I said, well, perhaps, my lords, you'll note this was a transcription by a court reporter from a tape recording which they heard, and perhaps you might note that there might be 2 dots between the 2 and the 9, and 2 dots between the 3 and the 9, and they looked, and by God, it was a correct quote. Well, don't worry, we'll get them on the next one, they thought. And then they said, it says here that the newspapers said this, Mr. Christie. There's no way that a newspaper would refer to Mayor Mel Lastman as a Jew. Goodness. Well, lo and behold, I had time at lunch to go over to the Vancouver Public Library, and a very helpful gentleman, as usual with an earring, decided that he would look it up for me, and he did. And lo and behold, there was the quote. And it wasn't the case that it said Mayor Mel Lastman, a Jew. It said Mayor Mel Lastman, the Jewish mayor of North York. So technically, there was a difference, but very slight. So after lunch and brought that back to their attention, they said, well, that doesn't matter anyway. We don't like the tenor of these messages is inconsistent with the order, and the appeal ultimately was dismissed. With costs. This is interesting, because in a criminal proceeding, you don't normally pay the costs of the trial that sends you to jail, but in this rather strange environment, you must pay the costs of the trial which puts you in jail. So, that was the result, and I thought, the time has come, when either we have to put up or shut up. The Ontario Legal Aid Society would not pay anything for this man, especially to a BC lawyer. I think there's a certain resentment about money going out of provinces, and I've detected that elsewhere in this great country of ours, about which I'll speak in a few moments. But then I decided the Canadian Free Speech League, which basically is common thinking people who defend individuals, and I'm talking about these cases because you'll never hear them anywhere else. You won't hear about them in the media. We gathered some money and thought we'd pursue it to the Supreme Court of Canada. Well, everybody said, no way, you'll get leave. We applied, and much to my surprise, we did get leave, which means you have permission to bring the appeal. And only a very small percentage of cases, very small percentage, ever gets leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. And little did I know that after that they required books upon books upon books, like 21 copies of everything, and it would cost a fortune. But there we are. We're on the way to the Supreme Court of Canada with the John Ross Taylor case. And as yet, there has been no decision. In fact, the appeal has not been argued. But there is still hope, you see, because people are still trying to defend those basic values that make real growth, progress, and search for truth possible. And that's what the John Ross Taylor case is really all about. Whatever the views of that individual may be, the society in which we live can never know whether they're right or wrong until and unless they can hear them. And at the moment that Big Brother can decide who will say what is true or what isn't true is the moment that you and I may as well check in our brains with our income tax return, because there's no further need for our brains whatsoever. Another interesting case that you may not really know much about is that of Imre Finta, because Imre Finta, has anyone heard of him? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. He's the first person in Canada to be charged with war crimes. Now, we all think that war crimes are wrong. I think personally that war is a crime, but, and it is. I mean, we train people to go out and kill other people, and they're trained to kill us. And I guess that's what war's all about. Half the time, it's not too much of a privilege to take prisoners, I gather, or at times it wasn't. Anyway, Imre Finta was a Hungarian member of what was then known as the Royal Hungarian Mounted Police. And he did what our Royal Canadian Mounted Police did to the Japanese. Under orders from his government, he rounded up these members of the Jewish faith, as they were then known, and he escorted them to the rail yard where the Gestapo took over and put them on trains, and they went to various parts of Germany, as far as anybody knew at that time, to work camps. So the Ministry of Finance had confiscated their property, as we confiscated Japanese property, to put it in a little bit of perspective. And the result was that he was obeying lawful orders, and he basically, when the war was over, left Hungary. Some of the members of the gendarme were hanged. Of course, many of them were, because the communists took over after 1945, gradually, not all at once. And the result of that was that he eventually came to Canada 45 years, well, roughly, later, about 1986. If I'm not mistaken, in the middle of the Zundel trial, an individual by the name of Saul Littman wrote to Prime Minister Mulroney and said, "I have reason to believe that Dr. Joseph Mengele is or has been or has attempted to enter Canada." Well, we all know now that was utterly without foundation, as it was discovered in the inquiry itself. But that became the reason for the Deschênes Commission, which became the reason for the new laws. Now, I want to tell you what those new laws are. Because without these new laws, it could never be made a crime for Imre Finta to have obeyed the orders of the Hungarian government as an officer in 1945. The new laws are very simple in effect, although they're usually legalistically wrapped up in too much words. Too many words. In effect, they say that it was a crime, rather is a crime, to have obeyed orders in 1939 to 45 and done anything that was an inhumane act. That's right. It says all sorts of things. It says murder and confiscation, and then it goes on to all sorts of bad things and says any inhumane act or omission. So if you didn't do something that would have been humane in war, it's a war crime or a crime against humanity. Now, this law was passed by a so-called conservative government, and in addition to it, there was a specific section which said a person may be convicted under these laws, notwithstanding that they acted in obedience to the law at the time and in the place of the commission of the act. To put it in simple English, it means this. If 40 years from now a government was in power that wished to make it a crime to have listened to Doug Christie on the 25th of November 1988, when you are perfectly lawfully assembled here tonight to participate in the free and democratic expression of ideas, they could pass a law to so legislate, and that would be the equivalent situation. Now, they would say that, well, there's nothing wrong with what you're doing here, and there was something wrong with what he was doing there. But at that time and in that place, with a war on, it was no different than what our RCMP officers did to the Japanese here. And in effect, the interesting part is that a war crime can only be committed outside Canada. So every RCMP officer in the country who took some Japanese family out of their home, took them down to the railroad station, took their private property, put them on the train to Caslow or someplace in the interior of BC or Lethbridge, and maybe they went off there, and maybe some of them in the cold of the winter and perhaps not too good food conditions, even though we were winning the war, maybe some of them starved to death. Interesting. Would it be a war crime? No, because it was not outside Canada. Now, it's all very well for me or any immoral person to legislate our own will and say, what I do is right and what you do is wrong. But who in their right mind would think that a whole country would tolerate laws like that? I'll tell you why they are. I'll tell you why most people are tolerating them, because they didn't know about them. There was no major discussion of them. And how many people realized when, do you recall, when the Nova Scotia refugee influx happened with all the Sikhs who came ashore in Nova Scotia? Do you remember they rushed Parliament back to be reconvened to pass an immigration law that would stop ships on the high seas, and they couldn't do it? You remember that? Well, they did what I've just told you. They passed the law which introduced these so-called war crimes. And nobody heard very much about that. And the reason was they couldn't introduce it in June because they didn't get unanimous consent. And some of the debate that would have taken place from Alec Kindy and Mr. Witter from Toronto, two Ukrainians, who were concerned about the possibility of charging members of the Galician SS who were fighting against the Soviet forces. You see, they got on the wrong side in the war. They're afraid those people will be charged. Well, nobody gave a damn about them. And nobody really gives a damn about them now. And they probably will be. If they can get away with what they're doing with Imre Finta, they'll be next. And the Demjanjuk case in Israel will be repeated here, and it will cost thousands and thousands of dollars. And I'm going to tell you that in the Imre Finta case, they have now given an order to allow the Crown to take me and the defense and everybody else to Israel, to Hungary, to Austria, to Australia, not yet to Austria and Australia, and the United States. That's coming. To gather evidence, because these people don't want to come to Canada to testify. After all, if they came to Canada, they might be subject to perjury prosecutions if they lied. But they won't be where they come from, and they won't be leaving Hungary, and they won't be leaving Israel, and they won't be leaving anywhere else. And we'll be going over there and taking evidence according to the laws in place at their time and in their place right now. In fact, access to all the archives is controlled, of course, by these foreign governments, and the negotiations which allowed the Canadian prosecution authorities to get everything they needed was made without any consideration to the rights of the defense. We have no right to go to Hungary and demand to enter the archives. We can ask, and the Crown says, well, go ahead, ask. It's your duty. Go ahead. The fact of the matter is, if it was only necessary to ask, why did they need a diplomatic exchange of notes whereby it was agreed that they, the prosecution, could? The answer is obvious. The fact is, the Hungarian People's Republic is not a democratic society. Notwithstanding all the talk of glasnost and openness and all that tripe, the fact is they still function on the basic premise that a criminal prosecution is a political matter to be decided in the political interests of the state. And more, in this country, the prosecution of criminal matters is being decided as a political matter. And you and I are here tonight because we care about that, and I think in a few moments I can tell you things we can do about it. The case of James Keegstra is another example of new laws and new methods of action which I never thought would be possible in this country. A man who basically taught within a wide open curriculum his views of things and other views of things, was convicted under Section 281, subsection 2, bracket 2, of promoting hatred against an identifiable group, and in spite of the fact that nobody really denies they are his honestly held religious beliefs, he was sentenced to pay a fine of $5,000. He appealed, he won his appeal, and the Court of Appeal said, this law puts the burden of proving the truth of that belief on the accused. And that is a reverse onus which is contrary to the presumption of innocence, and it's wrong. And it also said hatred is vague. What I hate, you might like. What you like, I might hate. And what is hate then? It is a subjective assessment of my opinion of you. There is no other criterion by which hatred can be measured. When you come right down to it, that's the story of every kind of conflict in history. I always hate what someone else, when we conflict. You and I will always hate what the other one believes. It's the nature of conflict. But one cannot, in the absence of violence or some act of destroying someone else's property, how can you say that it's a crime to hate? I think it's true that Christians are commanded to hate evil. I recall my baptismal promises quite well. Do you reject Satan and all his works? I do. Do you hate evil? Of course. That's part of our obligation. We're not supposed to just say, well, evil is evil. Maybe some people like it, some don't. It's not my thing. Well, that's ethical relativism and that's humanism, but that is not necessarily the faith of the Christian church, as I understand it. Now, it may be the faith of the new church, the liberated church, the new theology church, but it's not necessarily the Christian faith at all. And if there are some Christians who maintain it is not, it ought to be their right to hate evil and to hate the devil and all his works. In any event, when Keegstra won his appeal, that was certainly not the end of the matter. Somebody set fire to his house. Did they find them? No. We haven't got time for that. We've got more time to prosecute people for their words than we have to prosecute people for setting fire to somebody's house, and that is a deed. You see the total inversion of values here. A man's words are are really basically harmless until some act occurs as a result. You cannot even say they have any consequence. Tonight, if you don't do something as a result of what I'm saying here, I might as well have stayed home. It's a pointless exercise for me to babble to you. Obviously, words have no effect unless they cause action. And action can be for good or for evil. And the determination of the real effect of words is, what do they do? What do people do when they hear these words? Well, of course, no one has ever demonstrated in any case that the words of James Keekstra caused a single incident of the slightest inconvenience to anyone. Nor was it expected that they had to prove a consequence, and that was another reason the Court of Appeal struck down the section. Now, the Crown, not satisfied with the fact that his house was burnt, and I might say it was well known and obvious that he and his wife and family were in there at the time. That's not an attempted arson, that's an attempted murder in the middle of the night to set fire to somebody's house when you know they're in there. That case was then appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, and now we're in a position where we have to go forward to the Supreme Court of Canada and face another action on their behalf. I might say in the case of John Ross Taylor, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, 6 attorneys general interceded. 6 intervened from all sorts of provinces. I don't know if New Brunswick was one, Quebec was one, Ontario was one, Manitoba was one, BC was one, and others. And you know whose side they're on? The Government of Canada, not mine. So when I go to the Supreme Court of Canada, there's going to be Doug Christie and the Canadian Human Rights Commission lawyer. Then there's going to be the Attorney General of Canada's lawyer. Then there's going to be 4 Attorney General's lawyers, or 6. And they will have their say, and I will have mine. And that'll be fair, won't it? And guess who's paying for me? James Keekstra. And who's paying for them? All 8 of them. You are. Shame. Exactly. But what are people aware of in this respect? Not very much, because the media does not allow this information to be communicated. The case of Ernst Zundel, you may know, was one which was basically a 32-page brochure in which he published what someone else wrote, which questions the numbers of those who are alleged to have died in the Holocaust, the scheme or plan, and whether there was gas chambers. In other words, the difference between manslaughter and first-degree murder, if you want to be technical about it. That's really all that pamphlet debates. 32 pages with his introduction and his extra, which is basically, here I am, Ernst Zundel. If you like, you can take it or leave it. This is my belief, and these are my reasons. He put down names of people who he had relied upon to come to this conclusion, and that was it. Do you know how many thousands of pages of transcript have arisen out of those 32 pages of print? Well, I'll tell you, the last trial was 10,000 pages. The trial before that was probably 5,000 pages, and the appeal would have involved, from our case alone, about 15,000 pages worth of authorities and texts and briefs. And we've been to the Ontario Court of Appeal and won, and then the Crown appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada because they got lots of money, and they lost. And then within 20 minutes, Mr. Ian Scott was saying, we'll charge him again, and back to court we go again, and we go to trial from January to May, and we go every day with a jury and a judge, and you paid for all that one way or another. And time after time, it's obvious that nobody in their right mind can see any point to these stupid prosecutions. It goes even farther than that, because the media has given us only one point of view on these, and that is that these are the ultimately evil people. They must be eradicated. And if they could stir up a mob to do more than burn their houses, I think the media sometimes would. They can't and they won't. There's another more insidious form of monopolization of the public mind and manipulation, and that is in the case which I recently discovered of international affairs. Because you see, in our world today, we cannot ignore the fact that in spite of all the talk of glasnost, perestroika, and the rest, communism is not in retreat. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia might change slightly, but what about El Salvador? What about Nicaragua? What about Angola? What about Mozambique? What about Zambia? What about Tanzania? In Mozambique, for example, there is a group known as Renamo. And the media of the world wants you to believe Renamo are terrorists. I was amazed to find that Renamo has a very interesting philosophy. If you could just get me the manila envelope that's on the table back there, I want to read you that, a little piece out of it. Just bring it over here. Because Renamo, I found out to my surprise, believes in something different than the Mozambique government. It believes in private property, the family, a decentralized economy, and democracy. And we call them terrorists, and we pay for the destruction of these people. I didn't know this until I read a policy statement of this organization, and there's a reason why I mention this, because all the media are upset because an individual in Canada dared to write what they knew because they were from Renamo. For example, I'll read you a couple of paragraphs and you get an idea what these people really stand for. He says, the great misfortune of this century, however, has been that freedom from foreigners has not meant for most Africans freedom from slavery. Dictatorial and socialist regimes have too often taken the place of the departing foreigners. Planned economies and one-party states, not open markets and democracy, have dampened the spirits and the production of millions of Africans. The terrible result has been the famine, the bloodshed, the unhappiness that define much of Africa today. It says further, an even more ominous threat has reared its head in parts of Africa, including Mozambique, the specter of domination by imported and imposed Soviet-style communism. It should be no secret that the riches of Africa and her people are a tempting prize for the global planners in Moscow. By securing arms and inspiration from that communist giant, Frelimo, which is the government of Mozambique, has attempted to supplant Portuguese colonialism with Russian colonialism by proxy. He says, further, he says, what is it about Marxism, Leninist communism that produces a Holocaust wherever it is imposed? It is the simplest terms. It is the very core of the communist philosophy, a total disregard for human life and human rights and the elevation of the all-powerful state as the highest good. I agree with this, and I think it's typical of our own country where the state must decide what is true, what is right, what is hate, what is not hate, and we as individuals are not allowed to see for ourselves and find out for ourselves. Well, I just give you that, and you can look at it. I have a copy later. But the reason I mention it is because it opened my eyes to a reality that the control that we exercise in Canada over the country and its people is the same kind of control we exercise over our knowledge of the rest of the world. The difficulty arose when a man from this organization known as Renamo found or was revealed to be a refugee in Canada, and he wrote a letter to the Globe and Mail. And in the Globe and Mail he said, you know, all the things you've said about Renamo are untrue, and we have not been involved in atrocities. Mozambique needs peace, but it doesn't want the peace of the jail cell. And then all hell broke loose because in Victoria and elsewhere, this man was under investigation. How did this terrorist get into Canada? How did this person happen to become a Canadian refugee and a landed immigrant? Suddenly, after how many other refugees have come here with criminal records from other countries, suddenly this man is subject to an international press storm, which you may hear more about even yet, because the name Fernando Notomoise will be a name that you may hear more about. He's now, of course, in a situation where he's practically in siege in his home, and his wife and children naturally are very concerned because he spoke out, and now the whole world has come down upon him because he doesn't represent the official view of history of the Canadian government, which says there's only bandits that fight the communist government of Mozambique, and we believe the communist government of Mozambique is the good government of Mozambique. We don't want anybody here saying otherwise. The danger, of course, is that you can't trust Big Brother. Big Brother, in effect, big media, big government, ultimately has no monopoly on truth, but it can get a monopoly on your mind and mine. And to tell you that there is anything that's dangerous in our society, that is it. That we cannot rely on Big Brother to become informed of reality. We have to fight this by creating our own media of communication. And I might say that the Canadian Free Speech League, along with subsidizing and helping the defense of people charged, tries to communicate what's going on and publishes every month a letter about these various cases and things that are before the courts that you'll never hear about otherwise. It's called the Friends of Freedom newsletter. And we, of course, contribute it to everyone who wants to know. And part of the opportunity to do that is given by virtue of the fact that people support it, because it tells them things they wouldn't otherwise find out. We therefore are involved in trying to create a media of communication. That's an essential starting point for change. Because if we don't know the truth, we cannot be set free. And if we cannot find the truth from the media, we have to find it from ourselves. Step one, then, is to create our own media of communication. Step two is to write to newspapers. Once you have knowledge, then the time has come to say, I am prepared to stand behind what I believe, and I am prepared to say so. Now that is involving a certain amount of courage, but keep in mind and in perspective, this does not involve the courage that has been required in the past to fight for freedom when we didn't have it. It doesn't require the risk of life and limb or property. It might for some individual if they stand alone, but it will not be so if we stand together for the right of communication. So we must begin then to communicate what we know by writing to newspapers, phoning into open line shows and radio shows in defense of freedom of speech, and putting forward information about these individuals that the people will never get otherwise. We must take advantage of the existing media to the extent that we can. We must write to MLAs and elected representatives. Now that isn't always something that you like to do. Nobody likes to write letters, but you know, it's a small price to pay, very small price to pay for freedom. We think, too, that we can help you to organize to do that, and that's by means of a petition. Now, you've seen lots of petitions, and lots of them go into the garbage, but they have very important effects. This is a petition which I have drafted and got 100 copies over here. Now, don't think for 1 minute that you're putting your name on this petition really makes that much difference. It doesn't. One name on one petition is a very small contribution, and it's not what we can do. It's a very small part of what we can do. This petition, for instance, is to the Honourable Frank McKenna, Premier and the Attorney General of New Brunswick. Whereas Malcolm Ross has been subject to threat of dismissal from his job as a teacher for certain things he has published, whereas Malcolm Ross has never communicated his private beliefs during his work as a teacher, and that's a point that has to be made time after time, whereas we believe in freedom of expression, thought, belief, opinion, subject only to such reasonable limits as are demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society, which is right out of the old charter that we're so lucky to have, whereas the Human Rights Commission and other government bodies may be used to silence speech in the process of protecting rights. You know, they always talk about group rights, never individual rights. Whereas certain public statements have been attributed to the Premier which appear to us, and I certainly think it's true, to threaten Mr. Ross's employment solely for his beliefs and opinion, we, the undersigned citizens of New Brunswick, hereby petition that all proceedings of any legal nature against Mr. Ross for his opinions be terminated, and he be allowed to express by writing or verbally his honestly held religious beliefs in his own way, on his own time, without any government interference. Now the thing to do, without risk to life and limb, without any real inconvenience, is to take one of these with you, unfilled out, and make about 10 copies somehow, somewhere. You can all do it. And then make sure these are filled out and sent by you with a covering letter to the Premier and saying, the people on this petition want to know what you're going to do about it. Demand an answer. Don't just send it to them. Say, this is my name, I've obtained this petition, I want you to know about it, and I want to know what you're going to do about it. And don't take no for an answer. Keep at it until you get a satisfactory answer. As long as they're getting letters, and they get lots from certain people, as long as they're getting letters who care about freedom of speech, they're going to know that what they're doing is not right and popular, at least with some people. It's better than if there's no opposition. And believe me, the power in this room right now, in your mind and mine, to change the circumstances pertaining to Malcolm Ross is enormous. It is like nuclear fission, if you wanted to use it. You could create with your own initiative and endeavor, without going out of your way, without spending a lot of money, without losing any time, you could enormously change the atmosphere pertaining to Malcolm Ross in this province. It's up to you if you want to do it. This is a vehicle you can use, and I suggest you do it. You have to realize that each of us makes sacrifices. Nobody should be expected to sacrifice everything. Everybody should be expected to sacrifice something. I certainly am willing, and as I have in the past been willing, to risk whatever it takes, and I'm delighted to do it, to defend Malcolm Ross or anyone else whose views are under attack by what I consider an officious dictatorial state. And I am very grateful to God who made me for the privilege of being a lawyer and doing what I can with the feeble talents I have to fight to defend those things in court. And I recognize not everybody has been given that privilege. But everybody has been given a brain, most people can read and write, and everyone has been given the ability to talk to friends and neighbors. And nobody's going to suffer for doing that. I would never ask you to do what I wouldn't do myself, and in fact I would never ask you to do as much as I'm willing to do myself, but I think I have a right, if you believe in these principles, to ask you to do something, and indeed whatever is within your power, to defend these rights for others, because they are also defended thereby for you.
Get more people to read Malcolm's books.
Exactly. Very good idea.
I don't believe Frank McKenna read one of his books.
No, and I heard him say he did. Well, by that I suppose he read the title. It's obvious to anyone who really does read those books that they immediately lose a great deal of anger that they had against Malcolm, created by a media who can do more with a raised eyebrow in a newscast than most people ever do in reading a book.
Couldn't read those books and condemn Malcolm.
No.
I read the whole thing through. The 3 solid weeks. There wasn't one thing I wasn't.
Well, I think it's important that those books and that information get out to people, but I would suggest too that if there's going to be a way to overcome these problems of communication, money is also necessary. Now, money is usually regarded as a dirty word. We all work for it. None of us like to spend it. We all know that it's hard enough to keep because the government takes a whole lot of it. And we are, in effect, fighting the government and a form of tyranny that creeps up on us, and it's almost like cancer. It drags the life out of us because it takes away our resistance to the power that's robbing us. But we do have some discretionary capital, as most of us have, I think. Most of us spend a lot of people spend $3 a day on cigarettes. Some people spend money on other things. We could all afford something, and if you can help Malcolm Ross and the New Brunswick Free Speech League or communicate with other groups that are trying to help, then I think you should think about doing that, because it's deeds that are more important than words. We have to indeed talk to everyone every day about freedom of speech. I might point out to you that in Calgary, some very intelligent people undertook a demonstration which caused some very interesting waves. These friends of mine, George and Ilsa, had another friend who was a veteran, and his name was Martin. Well, Martin on November 11th decided he was going to get dressed up with his medals and his Legion hat and go to the cenotaph with a sign. The sign said, "They died in vain. Freedom of speech lost without a fight. Zundel, Keegstrom, Malcolm Ross," etc., etc., etc. Within 3 minutes, some typical Canadian veteran grabbed that sign and ripped it to pieces, knocked it to the ground, and stomped on it because it reminded him that the freedom he had fought for indeed was being lost without a fight. You know, the truth is what really irritates some people, especially if they aren't doing anything right. And that must have struck a note. Well, you might think that was the end of the matter, and that here was some vainglorious effort by an individual that failed, eh? Not at all. Because there was the press there, and they reported this story. They didn't quote the sign, and so Martin wrote them a letter about why he did what he did, and Ilse and George wrote a letter quoting the sign and saying, did they really die in vain? See how it's done? You don't give up. You don't let them tear you to pieces. You don't let them stomp on your principles. You keep fighting and you keep fighting until they finally realize you are in the right. That's what they will do. That's a demonstration. Not everybody has the courage to do that. Most people think demonstrations are radical. And God knows none of us want to be radical. But the truth is, in a developing tyranny, sometimes it's the radical people who save freedom for everybody else. And that's what I'm proud about in what George and Ilse and Martin did. It shows some guts. Now there's going to be a school board election coming up. And you know what they're going to be trying to do in terms of that election. There are going to be people who will try to get on the school board whose sole objective will be the immediate, ruthless elimination of Malcolm Ross if they can. He has some friends on the school board now. You have the democratic power to do something about that school board. You could either run for that school board, you could form a committee to help Malcolm to find out who would not try to destroy him, and you could approach those people and say, where do you stand on Malcolm Ross's private right to communicate his privately held religious beliefs? Are you going to uphold that right, or are you not? And if they're not, you can work against them for somebody who will uphold those rights. Believe me, until you and I get organized in a political sense to do those sorts of things, politicians will laugh at us here tonight. We're just a bunch of what they'll call kooks or loonies or whatever. The minute they see their own political power threatened, they will begin to realize they've crossed swords with the wrong group of people. So that school board election is something you have a part to play in. I mean, if you really do care about freedom and we're not here just for amusement tonight, then we better start making some commitments to do something in the future to stop the growth of tyranny in this province and indeed throughout the country. Why? Why do we have to do this? Why am I here and why are we talking about freedom in a country where obviously we are free, aren't we? Well, I'll tell you what would happen if we told the media we were having this meeting here tonight. You'd find out how unfree we are. Because everyone here would be photographed and slandered on the news. And we'd find out just what little freedom we have. We have taken this opportunity to expand the meaning of free speech. And that is not just an academic discussion. This is no joke what this man and his family are going through. No joke. That's real for them. It should be real for us. The day we don't feel the pain of somebody kicked to death in the ditch is the day we don't deserve to feel pain. And we should start feeling what Malcolm Ross is feeling and getting a little angry about it. Freedom is really the only way for man to find truth. Because it isn't one truth that only one person can know. It's a truth we all have to find, and therefore freedom is everybody's business. We're the descendants of those people who really fought for freedom. We've had it given to us real easily. We've never really had to fight, I guess, since 1945. I suppose at that time most young men thought they were fighting for freedom. That's what they were told. And God knows we wouldn't want to question that now, would we? Well, maybe we would. Maybe we should. But if we don't have freedom now to question what they were doing and why, then what were they fighting for? I remember asking my dad from the day I was able to think, why did you go to the Second World War? What were you fighting for? And to be frank about it, I don't think my father could ever really come up with a real good answer. But freedom, I could understand that. And if it's true, it was a good reason. Well, freedom is what we're all about because we're descended from those people who fought for it. And if we have any allegiance to what they lived and died for, then we too must fight for it. Freedom once lost is a very bloody thing to regain. It does not come back easily. It's not like, the wheat that dies in the fall and falls in the ground and springs to life next year. Freedom is not like that. Freedom is a human creation, fought for by the highest ideals of the human spirit. And once destroyed, it is not a naturally regenerative process. Freedom as found in this country once found itself growing in what is now the Soviet Union, but after 1917, freedom has not lived there, and many men and women have died trying to achieve freedom there. And we have not seen the like of their sacrifices among our own people here. If it is our intention to be honorable descendants of our forebears, then we must know that freedom will not be lost, that we will maintain it. And those who said, to you we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high, that's us. If we're not holding it, then no one else is. And the worst thing we can have, and this I find is really our only barrier to doing what we ought to do. The worst thing that there is throughout every part of society today in this country is fear. It is fear of the unknown. It is fear of the dark. It is really fear of nothing. It is that paralysis of fear which is totally unjustified. I would be equally displeased to have anyone say that the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops represented me, as I would be displeased if I were a Jew to say the Canadian Jewish Congress represented me. Because the Canadian Catholic Bishops often do not, when they speak on politics, I can assure you, speak for me. And yet, our government seems to take the view that there's only one voice for the Jewish people, and that is the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Dai B'rith, who have an axe to grind. And that must be opposed, not because we dislike anyone or their religion, but because tyranny in whatever its shape or form, from whatever group it may come, is unjustified and must be opposed. There cannot be this aura of invincibility or absolutely unacceptable criticism for any group, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from, no matter what their religion may be. I think of the economic statement of Remy Deroux, my bishop in Victoria. I don't agree with him. He was appointed to the Human Rights Tribunal in British Columbia by the NDP, and I guess that says something about his political beliefs and opinions. He should have every right to them, but I don't have to share them. He's not speaking in matters of faith or morals. I recently read where an article said that the Catholic Church had condemned Renamo. So I phoned up the author of this statement just the other day, and I found out, oh, I didn't say the Catholic Church, he said. I said development and peace. I said, well, you realize, of course, that there's a difference. But there you see is, and he did, but there you see is where the press begins its process of deception and distortion, and people begin to fear because big things scare people, don't they? The Catholic Church condemns, it must be wrong, naturally. Most Catholics would say so. And if large groups supersede our own individual judgment and our own individual use of our mind, then we might as well throw our brains away. We should never abdicate our own intelligence. We have to take initiatives to do things, to exercise our mind, to make our judgments sound and correct. And we can't be lazy and sit back and say, well, somebody else can decide. I don't need to inquire. We all need to inquire because we must all seek the truth, wherever it may be. After all, I mean, Martin Luther, what happened to him? Why, certainly Martin Luther was excommunicated. Galileo, they threatened to burn him at the stake and he recanted. Same with Copernicus. It's no good for society. It's no good for me and it's no good for you not to exercise our native born intelligence and to participate in finding out for ourselves. Because there is within us the spirit of greatness. The spirit of every man and woman who has fought for freedom is within every single one of us. We are the sons of those men who stood cold and wet and fearful upon many battlefields for freedom and yet were resolute. Here tonight are the daughters of every woman who waited alone with faith and hope and courage, keeping the family together for whom those men would fight. The spirit of courage of those previous generations lies within us. We must keep faith with those heroic sacrifices. That is truly our culture. That is our link with our families, with our heritage, with our true selves. Those in history who have done most to advance the progress of mankind from where we were to where we are were always unpopular. Christ was crucified. Socrates was executed with hemlock. Joan of Arc was burned as a witch. Galileo was forced to recant. Martin Luther was excommunicated. Without these people, this world would be a place of death and desperation. We must be like they were, the light of the world. We must be like they are, an inspiration by our courage to fellow human beings in despair. We must be what we are, capable of greatness and self-sacrifice. We were not born animals to breed and feed, forgetful of the noble sacrifices of our forebears. We are the future, and we are to the future what they are to the past. If only we will seize the time in which we live upon this earth, if only we will throw our selfish, shallow fears and cowardice far from us, seize the issue of our time, which is personal freedom. Fight with all our minds, and fight with our heart, fight with all our soul. The hour is indeed late. Few are our allies. The evil force of communism and statism, the view that the state knows all, the state must have all, the state must control all, has spread its blight over more than half the world, and even now burrows like a worm into the bosom of our own sorry land. But times such as these were sent to try the souls of all of us. No glory of battle calls us out today. We risk not life or limb. We only risk being bored to death as freedom dies. Therefore I say, think, rise up, and speak out, so no one can say they didn't know. Let men be free, that truth may be known. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Before Kevin comes back up, I have the privilege of presenting Mr. Christie with a plaque. Would you come up, please? This plaque says, Think Free 88, which is a campaign that we launched this summer. It states, whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. And that was said by Benjamin Franklin. To Canada's battling barrister for his continual perseverance in the struggle for a free and just society, may our Lord bless you in your endeavors. Presented this 25th day of November in the year of our Lord 1988 by the New Brunswick Free Speech League, Terence LeBlanc, President.
Well, thank you. I'm very touched by what you've done. I certainly appreciate it. I want you to know that it'll be on my wall and remind me of this very happy occasion. Also, I want you to know that whatever you may do, wherever you may be, we who stand with you out there on the West Coast will be with you in our spirit, and we'll be praying for your success, and we will be giving you every assistance we can. It's always true that you get lonely in the fight sometimes, but I'm very grateful tonight to have had the friendship and the loyalty of those of you who are here, and to know that as long as you live, the spirit of freedom lives. And I with you. Thank you.